So welcome once again. We do apologize to the viewers there for that technical challenge, but we are back with you. We are at this CNBC Africa special. We are at the Inward Buying Investment Mission. It is being hosted by the Gauteng Growth and Development Agency. It is in the lead up, of course, to the 15th BRICS Summit, which is just less than 10 days away or so. So the conversation that we're having this morning is how to increase the level of intra-South to South trade and how to ensure that the value supply chains that need to be adequate are up to par at this present moment in time. And the conversation I am having is with the lovely gentlemen who are joining me on stage. And this time I'm going to begin with the gentleman on my far right, Muzwetu Matema. He's the Group Executive for the Business Intelligence at the GGDA. Seated next to him, Mr. Stavros Nicolaou, the Executive Director of Aspen Pharmacare, as well as a representative of the South African chapter of the BRICS Business Council. And then next to him, Mr. Pravi Tripathi, Director for Ferrum Iron Ore, but speaking to us in his capacity as President of the India Business Forum of South Africa. And as I was saying, prior to that technical glitch, I do also have the chairperson of the Commercial Aviation Manufacturing Association, Mr. September. And we are here to talk about the strength of those value chains. And perhaps let's start off with what the picture of those value chains looks like right now. I think that the supply chain has been so integral and has been a focal point for most economies in the past 3 years, coming from the disruption of the pandemic and then the disruption of course, the war, and then some of our own internal disruptions here in South Africa being the challenges on our logistical line, which has made us difficult to get out and get in as many goods as perhaps we would desire. So, Mr. September, so if I begin with you as to the state of the supply chain right now, what is it looking like from an aviation point of view?
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity, and good morning to all attendants. I'd like to just add another step backwards a bit.
Sure.
Before the pandemic, there was already we call it a lager mentality. This is probably a South African name, which is some grouping, folding together or withdrawing that was happening in the marketplace, especially in the aerospace manufacturing space. So the pandemic only served to exacerbate that pulling back, people going back into their own spheres, well, their own countries really, and the so-called globalization, the effort to try and roll it back out of the international character of globalization to a more nationalistic approach. So that has been strengthened by COVID. And after COVID, also the recovery has not been equal in all sectors. I have obviously a little bit more authority in terms of my knowledge to speak about aerospace. In the aerospace, the South African environment has been devastated, to say the least. The combination of pulling back, COVID, and obviously our own situation in South Africa in terms of the public spend in aerospace and defense has meant that the survival of the industry is really on the line.
Sure.
But it's not on the line because of politics, but because of the supply chain. Okay. It is your subject, and I'd like to just say that in the space we play, aerospace, that's where really the geopolitics has the strongest influence in terms of viability, sustainability of manufacturing. I'd like to just leave it there. I'm sure I'll have an opportunity to expand on that.
Most definitely, and I'm looking forward to unpacking further what you meant by the holes in the supply chain in aerospace right now. But Praveer, just to your point, I think that the earlier this year, I get the dates wrong, but the whole world, or the BRICS grouping, I'm sure, was clapping essentially for India, as it did surpass one of the largest economies in the world to occupy a spot in the 5th place and a spot that it is comfortably enjoying right now. We also know that India is quite a significant market for South Africa, and that quite a big Indian population outside of the country actually calls South Africa home. As you look at it, and just speaking with the hat of the Indian Business Forum, what is your experience as a business forum of the supply chain right now?
Thank you, Fifi. Thank you for having me here, GGDA. Good morning to everyone. Yes, we're on the path of becoming the 5th largest economy, and we are on the path of becoming the 3rd largest economy. I think within the 5 to 7 year period. So somehow, and I'm aware that there is a huge Indian origin population here in South Africa. It's the largest Indian population anywhere in the world.
Sure.
It is in South Africa. So the trade between India and South Africa in context with the BRICS, I think India is perhaps the only country amongst the BRICS nation which runs a trade deficit with South Africa, meaning South Africa has a trade surplus, which is a good thing. It's not a bad thing at all. It's a very minor kind of surplus, but it's a good thing. And I've been talking about this in a lot of panel discussions, that there is so much more which could happen and which is not happening. And the intent is there to increase the trade. In terms of, so many things, collaborations could be forged in education, IT sector, agriculture. And this BRICS summit which is happening is actually, these conversations are being held in a very, very fruitful manner. I just saw a news today that there was some collaboration within the agricultural space amongst the BRICS nations, which is a very welcome and positive step. But coming back to your question as to the value chain between the BRICS nations, I think the pandemic did hurt the entire supply chain very, very negatively, and we are just coming out of it. We are seeing a bounce. The bounce is more prominent amongst the BRIC, if I may call it, leaving out the S. The S is kind of facing is lagging behind in catching up with the other BRICS nations. There are a number of reasons for it. I mean, we don't have the time and energy and space to actually go through each and every one. But these things need to be discussed, and because the S amongst the BRICS has to contribute positively to this grouping. This grouping, I would like to see in the next 5 to 10, next decade, the BRICS not as a BRICS plus or whatever. It's a good welcome step. I mean, he's sitting right next to me. But I would rather see BRICS as a G5 in the next decade. And that would be the real, fructification of the entire idea of these developing countries coming together and challenging the established norm of G5, G7, and G20, and this grouping becomes the next G5, and that is something which I look forward to very, very positively, and I'm positive we can achieve it.
Okay. I noticed that you did get a couple of nods in the room when you expressed that vision, so clearly a few audience members on the same page as you in terms of ramping up the scale of the potential of BRICS. But you have said that essentially that potential might not be reached if the S doesn't do its job. So speaking on behalf then, Stavros, of the S in BRIC, as a representative of the Business Council, speaking on behalf of the various sectors within the Council, but also a sector that you know quite dearly, being your home sector, pharmaceuticals. Talk to us then about your view on the supply chain and perhaps even a comment as to what Pravir did allude to in the S maybe bringing down the potential of the bloc right now, as it were.
Fifi, good morning, and thanks very much for having me, and good morning to all the viewers and participants. It's probably not by accident that I'm sitting behind the South African flag. Fifi, I was trying to work out how you got all this configuration going, but I now understand from your question. So there are a couple of aspects to the question that you've asked, and let me respond as follows. I think firstly, we have to recognize what is the value of the BRICS formation. It's a relatively new formation, and if you were to ask me as a business person, what is the attraction of BRICS, I would tell you the following. I think firstly, BRICS, as loosely as some might call it, as a collective bloc, contributes 31.5% of global GDP. Now, you can never underestimate that. It's just recently eclipsed the G7, which contributes 30% of global trade. The second thing is, these are developing and emerging markets. Okay, you can probably question whether China is still developing and emerging, but there are elements of China that are developing and emerging. And that is where the growth opportunities present. And that is why the S in BRICS is so important, because the next frontier of growth is going to be the African continent. So the S is not a small s or a capital S. It's very much a capital S that looks to integrate Africa into the equation. And incidentally, Africa has a population of 1.3 billion inhabitants, and that is set to double by 2050. So that will become one of the most populous regions in the world, and these are where the growth opportunities present. Now, growth opportunities can only be realized through partnerships, and that brings me to the next benefit of belonging to this club called BRICS, is that the diversity of the 4 BRIC partners, and if you add South Africa in that, and South Africa is a very innovative country. I mean, you said the medical industry is very close to my heart. It is. I live and breathe it all day long, Fifi. But, you know, we were the first ones to do a heart transplant. There are many firsts. We were first to genomically sequence the alpha variant during, the beta variant and the Omicron variants during COVID. So that is the other benefit, and all of these things interlink into backward and forward linkages, which is really the topic of conversation today. So let me just try and summarize by saying the following, that we are set as the S in BRICS to look at 3 immediate priorities, and this is the work of the Business Council. When you chair the council, you also get to a degree to determine what the agenda is. Our 3 overwhelming priorities are the following. Number 1, Africa Continental Free Trade needs to be integrated into BRICS. Number 2, we've analyzed the trade patterns, and I'm going to disagree slightly with my colleague here. We run a trade deficit with India, regrettably. But this is not...
Is that new?
Yeah, and I've got the stats, yeah.
Okay.
But it's not really about who runs surpluses, who runs deficits. The benefit of analyzing trade patterns is you get to see what are the products you are importing, what are the products you're exporting. Now, I was amazed, and I'm not sure how many of our Brazilian colleagues and friends are in the audience. And if you are, bon dia. But our second biggest export to Brazil, as South Africa, is centrifuge machines. Now, who would have thought that? I'm sure 1% of this grouping would have understood that it's centrifuges. So that tells me something. It says we can sell centrifuges in China, in India, and in Russia as well. So trade deficits are about working out the patterns to see where the complementarities and strengths reside. And BRICS is all about leveraging scale, particularly economies of scale, leveraging a common mindset, and lastly, leveraging the complementarities. And the complementarities are what will give you those backward and forward linkages.
Okay.
Fifi, thanks very much.
Okay, no, thank you. So certainly not a small S, not an insignificant S, given its gateway potential, but certainly an S that perhaps can do a little bit more to really harness its gateway potential into the rest of the continent. Muzi, just your thoughts here. As the GGDA, you are an agency that is very important in not only growing the economy of Gauteng, but essentially the economy of South Africa, just given the size of Gauteng to the entire country. Your view then on the ground as to what is happening with companies that you're trying to take to the rest of the world and companies that you're trying to invite here into South Africa, as it does pertain to the BRICS trade relationship. What is going on the ground right now? What are you seeing by way of that supply chain and its potential value?
Thank you, Fifi. That's quite a complex question, but I'll just take a few steps back, like what all the other gentlemen have done, just to contextualize the heart of the matter. So Stavros gave a picture of, the BRICS region overtaking the G7 in terms of economic output a few months ago. So currently the BRICS region versus the G7 is now significantly large. But what's also important, apart from contributing 30 to 32% of global GDP, the BRICS region now accounts for close to 44% of global manufacturing. And since this is a manufacturing discussion, I just wanted to contextualize it from that extent. And of course, manufacturing has shifted in the past 30 years from being concentrated in the US, in Western Europe, to largely concentrated in a very critical member of the BRICS region, which is China. And we as BRICS member states have benefited quite significantly. I mean, we've seen a very rapid shift in terms of foreign direct investment coming from Western Europe, North America, to China being a very dominant foreign direct investor in Gauteng as well as in South Africa. And this is quite important from a manufacturing perspective, because whilst we contribute as Gauteng 35% of GDP, our manufacturing accounts for close to 50% of South Africa's manufacturing and close to 10% of Africa's manufacturing. And the foreign direct investment that we receive, 66% of foreign direct investment that we receive as Gauteng is from manufacturing. And if you look at the latest numbers, despite all the various challenges that we have as citizens towards how we feel about the country, self-esteem and perception issues, we are still the preeminent province in the continent in terms of receiving foreign direct investment. And a significant amount of that foreign direct investment is in the manufacturing sector. A good proportion is from China and from India and other sort of players. So that's just on manufacturing alone. And I'm just going to sort of like keep it at manufacturing. If we're to go to tourism, India, China, Brazil are significant drivers of tourism. If we're to go to various other sub-components. But at the heart of the matter, Fifi, what we do as the GGTA is really at the core face of facilitating the various challenges on one side that companies that come into the Gauteng City region face, but also sending companies to the rest of the world. So some of the challenge for companies coming in where we intervene on a face-to-face level is really the issue of how do we make sure that we've got specific regulatory measures and we communicate them very clearly. For example, most of the enterprises here would have had several challenges with, say, visa regulations that when they try and set up in South Africa. So we play the role of clarifying, fast-tracking all those regulatory bottlenecks. But over and above that, once you you've set up here, you do need assistance with maybe your water use license at a factory. You do need some assistance with attracting a certain incentive from the Department of Trade and Industry. And we play the role of making sure that the statistics that I've spoken about, but also the quality of experience that one experiences when they are in the process of investing in Gauteng and taking advantage of the endowment and the gateway access that Gauteng offers has got a team of people that can assist you in that. So we play the role of hand-holding various investors from the region, as I said, but what we've seen is increasingly over the past few years, that investment and foreign direct investment has come significantly from the BRICS region. But over and above that, the S in the BRICS is also a gateway S to the rest of the continent. Having said that, we are the largest African investor on the continent, but we're also the largest BRICS investor to the rest of the BRICS region in the continent. So you find, yes, there's Nigerian companies that invest in Russia, in China, in India, but South African companies by far lead the pack in investing in the rest of the region. As I said, and this doesn't negate the strength of investment that we do in all the other geopolitical regions. If there's one thing that we've been successful in despite the challenges, is really being in the middle of navigating changes in geonomic tensions and geopolitical tensions and still remaining relevant across all the geopolitical powers that now exist and the geonomic pressures. And we still continue to see that strength from a Gauteng perspective. And as I say, the complexity that we have as citizens is obviously navigating that against our own internal perceptions and challenges and, you know, what would call national self-esteem issues in light of the challenges that we do face as a country. But there's also the statistical reality of how endured and privileged we are as a province, as a country, and our ability to attract investment, our ability to create those partnerships still remains head and shoulders above the rest of the continent. Thank you, Fifi.
Okay.